The night was meant to be dazzling. Bright lights, high fashion, and the most influential names in the industry gathered under one roof. It was an exclusive event in Paris, a grand fashion show where models walked the runway with effortless grace. Cameras flashed and whispers filled the air as celebrities exchanged glances across the venue. Among them sat Johnny Depp, his presence drawing subtle yet undeniable attention. Dressed in his signature bohemian style, layered necklaces, rings glinting under the chandeliers, and a calm expression, he watched the show with quiet amusement. He had always appreciated artistry, whether in film, music, or fashion, but tonight, something was about to happen that would shake the air of elegance surrounding the event. She was not meant to be here. The young model, Elena, was a last-minute replacement. A newcomer in the industry, she had worked tirelessly for years, dreaming of a moment like this. But dreams, as she was about to learn, could shatter in an instant. As she stepped onto the runway, her nerves betrayed her. The towering heels on her feet wobbled slightly, but she took a deep breath, determined to keep going. The dress she wore, a shimmering silver gown, flowed behind her like liquid light. For a brief moment, she felt powerful. Then it happened. Her ankle twisted ever so slightly, but it was enough. A sharp gasp echoed through the crowd as she lost her balance. The world seemed to move in slow motion as she stumbled forward. Desperately, she reached out, trying to steady herself, but the weight of the dress tangled around her legs. And then, she fell. A stunned silence filled the hall. It wasn't just a small misstep, it was a full collapse. The sound of her body hitting the stage rang through the venue, and before she could even lift her head, the whispers began. Laughter followed. Soft at first, then cruel and unapologetic. The audience, filled with designers, critics, and models, watched as Elena struggled to rise. Some murmured in amusement, others looked away, pretending not to see. A group of models seated in the front row smirked behind their perfectly manicured hands. The industry was unforgiving. A single mistake could brand someone as a failure forever. The show continued around her as if she were invisible. And then Johnny Depp moved. As Elena lay on the runway, humiliation crawled beneath her skin, her cheeks burning from the weight of everyone's gaze. She could hear the laughter, feel the coldness of the moment pressing into her, threatening to swallow her whole. She had trained for this, dreamed of this day, only to find herself at the mercy of an unforgiving crowd. But amid the sting of rejection, there was one figure who didn't look away. Johnny Depp, seated near the front, stood up slowly. His calm demeanor had given nothing away up until now, but as his boots hit the floor with a soft thud, Elena's eyes instinctively flicked to him. He walked toward her. At first, the crowd didn't know what to make of it. Was he going to make a scene? Was he about to scold her for ruining the show? The whispers died down slightly, but they were replaced with confused murmurs. Why was Johnny Depp leaving his seat? But Elena couldn't focus on that. She couldn't think straight. Her heart pounded in her chest, the humiliation still coursing through her veins. She tried to stand up on her own, her legs shaking with the effort. But before she could even get her balance, Johnny reached out his hand. His eyes, warm and understanding, met hers. "Are you all right?" His voice, soft but firm, broke through the noise in her head. Elena hesitated. She felt the sting of pride and embarrassment mixing together. But there was something about his calm presence, his genuine concern, that made her take his hand. She nodded silently, not trusting herself to speak. Without another word, he gently helped her to her feet, never once making her feel small. His gesture was one of pure kindness, and in a room full of judgment, it was as if he was a lighthouse guiding her through the storm. The audience, still uncertain, watched in silence. But then something shifted. The room wasn't as cold anymore. There was a murmur, a shift in the air. Maybe it was Johnny Depp's unexpected act of kindness, or perhaps it was the sheer humanity of the moment, but the mood seemed to change. As Elena steadied herself, Johnny gave her a reassuring smile. He nodded toward the exit as if suggesting they leave the stage, but she shook her head. She was not going to let this moment define her. "Not here. Not now." "Don't worry," Johnny said with a quiet chuckle. "You're not the first person to trip on stage, and you won't be the last." His words, so simple, so direct, resonated deeply with her. The weight of the world didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and turned back toward the runway. The music, still playing in the background, filled the space between them, and the show went on. But something had shifted. Elena, no longer consumed by the embarrassment, walked down the runway with a new resolve. Her pace was slower, more measured, but every step she took was filled with a quiet confidence. And Johnny? He remained where he stood, watching her with a look of quiet approval, like someone who had seen beyond the surface, someone who understood the struggle of being human. Elena's walk wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Every step, every glance from the crowd, she felt the weight of their eyes less and less. The incident had rattled her, but with each stride, it felt more like a distant memory. She didn't need to prove anything to them, she just needed to prove something to herself. And somehow, Johnny Depp's quiet support had given her the courage to do that. As she reached the end of the runway, she took a moment to look out over the audience, her heart still racing, but her head clearer. The applause that followed wasn't deafening, but it was real. It wasn't the usual applause reserved for flawless performances, it was something different, something that spoke to the courage of standing tall in the face of adversity. Johnny's eyes followed her, and she caught a glimpse of him nodding in approval. A small, subtle gesture, but to her, it meant the world. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. The other models whispered in hushed tones, some looking at Elena with newfound respect, while others exchanged words of pity. But there was a different energy now. Her fall hadn't been a sign of failure. It had been a moment of transformation. She had faced the worst moment of her career, and survived it. As Elena made her way to the dressing area, she noticed the attention of one of the event organizers, a middle-aged woman named Clara, who had been watching her intently from the side. Clara had seen it all. The flaws, the mistakes, the success stories, and the failures. But there was something in the way Elena had handled herself that night that struck a chord. "Hey," Clara called out as Elena walked past. Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "You did well out there." Elena stopped, surprised by the compliment. "I fell," she said, laughing awkwardly. "I don't think that's well." Clara smiled knowingly. "It's not about the fall," she said. "It's about how you get back up." Elena had heard that before, of course. Everyone had. But for the first time, those words felt true. "Thanks," Elena replied, her voice thick with emotion. Clara stepped closer, her expression serious. "There's something more to you than just a model. Don't let tonight be the end of your story." Elena was about to respond when a sudden wave of exhaustion hit her. She hadn't realized how much the evening had drained her until now. The adrenaline that had carried her through the runway was starting to fade, but Clara's words lingered in her mind. The show continued in the background, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had changed her. It wasn't just about fashion anymore. It was about something deeper, a sense of resilience that had been awakened in her. As she sat down to remove the shoes that had betrayed her, a familiar voice cut through the noise. "I don't think I've ever seen someone own a mistake quite like that." It was Johnny. Elena looked up, startled to see him standing at the entrance of the dressing room. He wasn't looming or intrusive, just standing there, casually leaning against the doorframe, observing her with a calm expression. "Thank you," Elena said, unsure of how else to express her gratitude. Johnny's smile was small, but it was genuine. "You handled it better than anyone expected." He paused, his eyes thoughtful. "I've been around a lot of high-pressure moments, but tonight, you stood out for the right reasons." Elena didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to being praised, especially after such a public humiliation. But Johnny's words carried weight. "You should keep pushing," Johnny continued. "There's something real about you, something that doesn't need to be polished or perfected. That's rare in this industry." And with that, he left her alone to think. Elena didn't have all the answers, but in that moment, she knew one thing. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The following weeks felt like a blur to Elena. The fashion show was over, and the whirlwind of social media posts and articles started to flood in. The incident was, of course, a hot topic. A model's stumble on the runway wasn't something the world easily forgot. But what surprised Elena was the way people began to talk about her. At first, the comments were harsh. Memes circulated of her fall, each one more cruel than the last. Some laughed, Others mocked, but there were also whispers of admiration. Slowly, more and more voices began to change their tune. Did you see her recover? That was incredible. She might have tripped, but she didn't let it define her. That's real strength. By the time Elena saw the first positive article, she couldn't believe it. The headline was simple: "The fall that changed everything. Elena's resilience on the runway." It wasn't the story she had expected, and it wasn't the one she thought she'd get after such an embarrassing moment. Yet, somehow, she felt a shift. The industry that had seemed cold and indifferent was beginning to notice her for the right reasons. Then came the calls. One day, as Elena sat quietly at her apartment, a number she didn't recognize flashed across her phone screen. At first, she hesitated. Most calls were just spam or business inquiries she wasn't interested in. But something told her to pick up. "Hello, Elena? This is Clara from the fashion show. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Clara's voice was warm, and there was a sense of urgency in her tone that caught Elena off guard. "No, not at all," Elena responded, sitting up straighter. "What's going on?" "I've been speaking with a few people, and I think we can offer you an opportunity." "Something different," Clara explained. "You've caught the attention of some major designers. Not just for your looks, but for your attitude, your resilience. That's rare in this business." Elena felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. She hadn't expected any of this. She had never considered herself anything extraordinary, just a girl from a small town trying to make it in a cutthroat industry. But Clara wasn't done. "We'd like to offer you a contract with a few exclusive brands." Clara continued. "They're interested in working with you because of how you handled that moment on stage. They want to invest in you, not just your beauty, but your strength." The weight of Clara's words settled over Elena like a heavy cloak, and for the first time she realized that perhaps her fall hadn't been a setback after all. Maybe it had been the very thing that opened the door for everything she had ever wanted. "This is a big deal," Clara said, as if reading her mind. "But you'll have to move quickly. The fashion world moves fast, and opportunities like this don't come often." Elena barely processed her words. All she could think about was how, just weeks ago, she had been on the floor, humiliated in front of hundreds of people. And now the very industry that had nearly broken her was offering her the chance of a lifetime. Elena started, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," Clara replied. "But think about it. This could change everything for you." Elena sat in silence for a moment, her mind racing. It felt too fast, too unreal. But she knew this was the opportunity she'd been waiting for, the one that had been waiting for her to stop running from it. "I'll do it," Elena said finally, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. The decision had been made. As she hung up the phone, Elena felt something shift inside of her. For the first time in her life, she was choosing to take control of her own narrative. The world had seen her fall, but now it was going to see her rise. And rise she did. Elena's life took a sharp turn after that phone call. What began as a night of humiliation had slowly turned into a series of opportunities she never thought possible. Within days, she was signed by major designers and agencies, and her name began to circulate in the industry circles. At first, she struggled to adjust to the overwhelming nature of it all. The whirlwind of photo shoots, interviews, and runway shows came at her fast. It was like she had blinked and found herself at the top, no longer the naive model, but someone others now looked to with respect. But with the fame came new challenges. The pressure was constant, and the demands only grew. Elena had to maintain her composure, but each photo shoot felt like an act. She was no longer the young girl from a small town, but a polished, professional model who had to prove herself time and time again. Yet through it all, she held on to one truth: she could handle it. One evening, just after another exhausting show, Elena found herself alone in her hotel room, gazing out over the city. The Paris skyline stretched before her, the lights of the city twinkling below. She thought back to that night, the night of her fall, and the kindness that had come from Johnny Depp. He had been the first to show her that it was okay to stumble, that it was okay to not be perfect. That was the moment she began to believe in herself, to trust that she could get back up again. She had kept that lesson close, using it as fuel as she moved through the industry. The demands of being a top model were exhausting, but she was no longer the girl who crumbled in the face of judgment. She was stronger now. But even with all the success, Elena's thoughts often wandered back to Johnny. His unexpected gesture had changed the course of her life, and she wondered if he even knew the impact he'd had on her. Would he ever understand what it meant to her? Or was he just another celebrity who happened to witness a moment of weakness? It wasn't until a few months later, when Elena found herself backstage at yet another fashion show, that she would have her answer. The backstage area was chaotic, filled with makeup artists, stylists, and models preparing for their time on stage. Elena was adjusting her hair when she heard a familiar voice, low, calm, and unmistakable. Well, if it isn't the model who turned a stumble into a runway comeback. She turned to see Johnny Depp, leaning casually against a wall, watching her with that same calm expression she remembered so well. His smile was a little warmer this time, more knowing. Elena froze for a moment, unsure of what to say. But then, a sense of ease settled over her, and she smiled back. "You seem to be everywhere I go." Johnny chuckled, pushing himself off the wall. "I'm just a fan of resilience," he said, his tone light but with a depth that caught her attention. "You're doing great." Elena felt a flush of warmth spread across her chest. Those words from the person who had first offered her a hand when everyone else looked away felt like validation. They meant more than anything she had achieved in the industry so far. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady now. "It's because of you that I'm standing here." Johnny raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Me? You're the one who made it happen. You fell, but you got back up. I was just a small part of that moment." Elena shook her head. "You were the first to show me that I could." There was a brief silence as Johnny looked at her, his expression softening. Finally, he broke the quiet. "You've got something rare, Elena," he said. "Not just the looks or the confidence, but a heart that refuses to break no matter how hard life pushes. That's why you'll go far." Elena felt a lump form in her throat, the emotions of the past few months rushing back. She had worked so hard to prove herself, and hearing these words, so simple yet so sincere, was all she needed. "Thank you," she whispered again, this time with more emotion. Johnny smiled, then gave her a slight nod. "The world needs more people like you. Don't ever forget that." And with that, he was gone again, blending into the chaos of the backstage world. But his words stayed with Elena long after he left. She stood there for a long time, looking at her reflection in the mirror, realizing how much she had changed. She had stumbled, she had fallen, but she had risen, and she was going to keep rising, no matter what came next. The weeks following Johnny's words seemed to blur into one another as Elena's career reached new heights. She was everywhere, on magazine covers, gracing the covers of the biggest fashion houses, and walking in shows that were watched by millions. But the world she had once idolized was beginning to feel more like a prison than a dream. Behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. Elena felt like she was constantly being molded into something she wasn't. The designers wanted perfection, and the media wanted a flawless image of her. But every time she looked in the mirror, she saw the girl who had fallen on the runway, the girl who had fought through every obstacle to get where she was. That girl was still there, fighting to remain herself. It was at one of the largest fashion events of the season, a show that was the talk of the industry, that everything would come to a head. Elena had been invited to walk for a top designer, one known for being ruthless, both on and off the runway. She had heard the stories of how models were treated at his shows, the long hours, the constant pressure. But she had agreed, wanting to prove that she could handle it, that she could rise to the occasion. As the show approached, the tension backstage was palpable. Models, stylists, and makeup artists rushed around, but Elena's heart was heavy with dread. She knew the designer's reputation. She had heard stories from the other models about how he would push them to their limits. She wondered if she would be able to keep up. Johnny's words still echoed in her mind. "You have something rare." But in that moment, it didn't feel rare. It felt fragile. She walked down the runway just like every other time, one step after another. The lights were blinding and the cameras flashed in rapid succession. But there was a growing unease inside her. The weight of expectation felt heavier than ever. Halfway through her walk, she stumbled, not in the same dramatic way as before, but her foot caught awkwardly. A small falter. It wasn't the fall of the past, but the pressure to be perfect made her hesitate for just a moment longer. The designer, standing in the wings, shook his head, disappointed. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, and for a second she felt everything she had worked for slip away. The familiar fear crept back in. This was it. This was the moment where she would fail, and the world would watch. But then, a familiar voice cut through the noise in her head. "You have something rare, Elena." And just like that, everything shifted. Elena's steps became more confident, her posture more assured. She wasn't just walking down that runway for the cameras. She was walking for herself, for the girl who had fallen and risen. As she made her way to the end of the runway, she felt the energy change. The applause was different this time. There was a sense of awe in the air. Elena wasn't just a model now, she was a symbol of strength. Backstage, the designer's face was unreadable as she walked past him. His sharp gaze followed her, but there was something else behind it. It wasn't disappointment, it was recognition. Elena had risen. She had faced the pressure, the expectations, and the demons of the past, and she had not broken. She was more than just a pretty face in the spotlight. She was a force to be reckoned with. Later that night, as the show ended and the after-party buzzed with excitement, Elena found herself alone in a quiet corner of the venue. She had done it. She had made it through. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approach, and there he was, Johnny Depp. "You did it," he said with a soft smile. "You proved everyone wrong." Elena smiled back, her heart finally at peace. "I didn't just prove them wrong," she said quietly. "I proved to myself that I could do it." Johnny's eyes softened as he looked at her. "I told you, you've got something rare." Elena took a deep breath and looked out over the crowd. The flashing lights, the chatter, the music, all of it felt distant now. She had made it. And more than that, she had stayed true to herself. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Elena felt ready to face it. She knew that the next time she stumbled, because everyone stumbles, she would rise again. And this time, she wouldn't just be walking for the world. She'd be walking for the girl who had fallen and found the strength to stand tall. And that was the real victory. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed Elena's incredible journey of resilience and strength. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more powerful stories just like this one. Like the video if you believe in the power of overcoming obstacles, and feel free to comment below with your thoughts. How did this story resonate with you? And if you know someone who could use a little inspiration, make sure to share this video with them. Let's spread positivity and motivation together. Thanks again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.